There are plenty of doctors online that make this case that not everyone should be on a statin, even when they have good indication to be on a statin. Let's face it, pharmaceutical companies are not in the business of leaving money on the table. If these peptides worked, like truly worked, for fat loss, muscle building, anti-aging.
Most people are ordering these peptides from the black market. And we know when you order medications or anything, knockoffs from the black market, you have no idea what you're getting.
You know, like when a compound is claimed to do everything, it should make you pretty suspicious that it probably does nothing in particular. Today, the loudest, most certain voice is usually the one selling something, oftentimes a supplement or a peptide. Welcome to MD Longevity Lab, where we're playing the long game. This is a podcast where science meets real life with expert insights, practical tips, and real-world tools to not only live longer, but live better. Our aim is to radically change the way medicine is practiced and enable individuals to age gracefully, maintaining health span and vitality well into their later years. We're your hosts, Dr. Nisha and Dr. Vikas Patel, physicians, partners in life, and parents balancing work, wellness, and everything in between. Let's dive in. Welcome, everyone, back to the MD Longevity Lab podcast where we're playing the long game. I just wanted to kind of get out of the way. We're doing this episode today about really a topic, peptides, and we got a lot of direct messages about this topic. Please send us anything else that you want to have us cover or any questions that you might have. We do try to reply to those questions directly to whoever's sending them, but sometimes it makes sense for us to do podcast episodes and address them as well. So let me start off with this. I want you to try something the next time that you are out with friends, or maybe in the gym locker room, or in a group chat. Mention statins. Just drop the word. Everyone has heard of this cholesterol lowering medication, and then just sit back and kind of wait and watch and see what happens.
Yeah, I'm pretty sure you're going to hear things like, oh, I got muscle pain when I was on it, brain fog, Big Pharma is paying doctors to keep me on this medicine. My cousin stopped taking their statin and felt like $1 million. Someone's uncle, someone's brother, someone's neighbor, someone who listened to some influencer on Instagram and asked them to take a supplement instead of a statin, right?
Every single time. Now in that same conversation, mention peptides, mention BP157 or CJC 1295. Just watch the energy completely shift. Suddenly, everyone's an expert. Everyone knows a guy. Somebody's trainer's on it. Someone's buddy is stacking 3 of these peptides. Nobody asks at all about clinical trials. Nobody asks about FDA approval. The compound arrived via an Instagram reel, or better yet, Joe Rogan. And that's basically enough.
And the double standard is what really gets me. The same person who won't take statins because they don't trust Big Pharma is literally injecting a compound into their body that has been studied in, like 14 people total. And these peptides, it's a complete underground market. So most of these peptides are coming overseas and they're literally injecting it into their body, right? They ordered it from a website called blackmarket.com, graymarket.com. They found it on Reddit threads, but they're experts. Every single person that I've talked to that are on these peptides are like, don't worry, I've done my own research. It's like,
is it blackmarket.com?
I think it's graymarket.com. Please don't go on there and buy peptides. But what I'm saying is people are self-appointed experts, and this is like the Dunning-Kruger effect in full form. And to boot, they feel good because it's quote unquote natural, right? Because it's natural, it must be safe.
Natural. You know what else is natural? What? Arsenic, which is rat poison. You know what else? Cyanide, which, by the way, occurs naturally in apples and cassava root. Natural is not a safety profile. Natural is not a dosing guideline. Natural does not mean you should be drawing it up in a syringe and injecting it into your abdomen on Tuesday morning before work. This kind of really gets to the credibility crisis in American healthcare, really distilled into just, this one single contradiction. And it's really what we want to unpack in today's episode.
Speaking of unpacking, I have to brag about you for a second, because part of the reason we're doing this episode, we got so many questions about peptides, but then Vikas also wrote a Substack article covering this very topic, and it got published. And since then, you've had reporters and stuff all up in your grill.
I did. I did do a couple interviews. I wrote a piece for Statin News, and it had a fair amount of interest. So
I had to ask him last week if I needed to start scheduling in media availability since you're so big time now. Like, do we need a publicist? Do we need, is it paparazzi? These are like big journals.
I have groupies now.
You have more groupies. You have 18 followers on Spotify on your 90s playlist.
That's like 70.
70. That's probably about how many followers you have on Substack too. So You're growing.
That's right. The real point here is that I think the piece I wrote kind of hit a nerve, right? It's this, I made this kind of debate between statins versus peptides, why Americans have decided to trust a compound studied in, just 14 patients, and they trust that more than a drug that's been studied in 500,000 people. And that contradiction is really at the core of how we're evaluating medical evidence right now in 2026. And that's really what we're going to spend the next hour or so on, because the 800-word piece that I wrote, it doesn't do justice to really what this is all about.
And I'd like to weigh in too.
Can't wait.
Right. All right. So let's dive into the drug that everyone loves to hate.
Let's start with the boring one first, statins. I know I can feel people, reaching for the skip button already on their phones. But we have to lay down what the evidence actually says before we can have an honest conversation about peptides.
Especially because the same people who won't touch a statin are injecting mystery compounds from a mystery compounding pharmacy in Florida, but getting their peptides overseas 3 times a week. So let's get calibrated and press the reset button.
Okay, so statins are a class of drugs called HMG-CoA reductase inhibitors. They reduce cholesterol synthesis in the liver. They upregulate LDL receptors and lower circulating LDL, which is the lipoprotein most directly implicated in plaque formation within our arteries. They are, and this is not hyperbole, one of the most studied drug classes in literally the history of medicine.
Yeah, and for anyone who thinks most studied is just a talking point, you're wrong. There's studies that have pooled over 170,000 patients on these meds. And there was a 2024 meta-analysis of more than 500,000 people that found a 25% reduction in major cardiovascular events and a 40% reduction in all-cause mortality. That's significant.
And remember, these are 5-year outcomes. We're longevity doctors. We're interested really in 30 or 40-year trajectories, not 5-year trajectories. If you can see a mortality difference at 5 years, the effect over decades is much, much larger.
Yep. Now let's be honest about the other side. For primary prevention, people without established heart disease, the numbers are less dramatic. The number needed to treat can run from 200 to 470 patients over 5 years, depending on their baseline risk. So prescribing a statin to a low risk 42-year-old is a genuinely different conversation than prescribing one to a 58-year-old diabetic smoker with a family history of heart attacks.
I want to be really clear about this. we're not saying that every human being should be on a statin. What we are saying is that the decision should be made based on actual data, not with the fear generated by, someone on Instagram doing shirtless deadlifts.
I saw that the other day.
RFK Jr.
Oh, I hope he's listening.
I kind of hope so too.
Yeah. Let me tell you what this actually looks like in our clinic. Patient comes in, they get the whole workup. We do a full body DEXA scan, VO2 max, full biomarker blood testing, genetic testing, and a coronary calcium score. Let's say the coronary calcium score comes back at 180. This is a 48-year-old, let's say. Soft plaque, hard plaque, the works. Their ApoB levels are through the roof. Their Lp(a) is elevated. And their father had a heart attack at 50.
And then I recommend a statin.
And then where does the conversation go?
But doesn't a statin cause diabetes? Won't it give me dementia? Doesn't it deplete CoQ10? I heard it tanks testosterone. Isn't cholesterol actually good for you? Doesn't our body need cholesterol? This is a person who literally, just paid big bucks to find out with imaging that they actually already have coronary artery disease. They have heart disease. They do this workup. They get the answer that honestly they didn't want to get, which is they've got some disease. And then they don't want to take the single most useful, most evidence-based tool that we have to change their trajectory.
Yeah, it's like going to a car mechanic, having him diagnose the problem with your engine, and then telling him you searched on Reddit that oil is bad for your car when you need an oil change.
We can usually get there. We can usually make the case, but we have to dismantle all these myths before we can, build to that right decision.
So this brings us to side effects. Myth number 1. In clinical practice, up to 30% of patients report muscle symptoms that they attribute to their statin. That sounds alarming. So let's talk about the SAMSON trial.
I love this trial. It's like one of the most elegant studies in modern medicine. Basically, this is like brilliant. They took a bunch of patients who had previously quit statins because of the side effects and randomized them into either getting statins or getting a placebo or getting no treatment at all. Patients then rated their symptoms daily on a smartphone app, and the result is just crazy. Symptom scores were essentially identical between the statin group and the group receiving a placebo. 90% of the symptom burden was what we call the nocebo effect, the expectation of side effects causing side effects. And half the patients in the trial were able to successfully restart the statin afterwards. Like, it's just crazy how many people have been programmed to say that this drug is bad, that when they don't actually know what they're getting, they just assume the drug is bad and I'm having symptoms, even when all they're getting is a sugar pill.
Yeah. That's 90%, 90% of the symptom burden was the nocebo effect. That's crazy.
That's 90% of patients who previously already had symptoms, quote unquote symptoms, to a statin. So these are the people who actually thought they had symptoms when they were on a statin. And then when they're randomized into this trial, we find out that 90% of them actually never had a symptom.
Crazy.
So, the true pharmacologic muscle symptoms, which are the things that I think most people fear that can actually happen from these drugs where patients can get muscle soreness or muscle breakdown, it's actually somewhere near 0.5% to 2%. Everything above that threshold is coming from something else. Basically, Instagram, Joe Schmo giving advice, their neighbor, who knows?
Or you know what? When you're old, your muscles hurt. That's what happens. It's not because of your statin. Sometimes you're just old and things hurt. But people always want to blame their medicine or something else instead of just being like, yeah, this is life.
Yeah, I think it comes from the same kind of cultural machinery that is now selling something far less studied, right? At 4 times the price with none of the data. And that's where we're going to head to next. I think I want people to understand before we move on to peptides that there are plenty of doctors online that make this case that not everyone should be on a statin, even when they have good indication to be on a statin, because they look at that number needed to treat, 400 patients need to be treated for lowering the risk of a heart attack in one patient. And that's over 5 years for people who don't have any other risk factors, right? But that number, if you take that out from 5 years to 30 or 40 years, right? If you're a 30-year-old with high cholesterol and we're expecting you to live until you're the average lifespan up to 80 years of age, right? So now you have 50 years of high cholesterol, and the number needed to treat really drops from 1 in 300 or 400 down to like 1 in 2 to make a difference. And so those odds really do matter. And that's why I think a lot of the physicians online that are critics of this drug are just not doing the math correctly, and they're not making the right conclusions from the data that we have now. So got that off my chest.
I'm so glad you got that off your chest. All right, let's move into the next segment, the compounds that everyone loves to trust. Let's talk peptides. SS31, MOTS-C, BPC-157, CJC-1295, sermorelin, melanotan, right, which makes you tan by injecting yourself, literally stimulating melanocytes. And when we stimulate melanocytes, we also get melanoma as a side effect. Surprise, surprise. So spend 5 minutes in the biohacking space and you'll hear these names spoken with near religious reverence. It's crazy.
Here's something most people don't really understand or know. Like many of these, and this is like a common misconception, like literally, I was just on a physician forum yesterday and physicians don't even know this stuff. Like many of these compounds, they actually were studied through FDA trials, right? Like sermorelin, CJC-1295, ipamorelin. These started off as pharmaceutical compounds. Sermorelin was actually FDA approved for growth hormone deficiency in children. It had a legitimate pathway.
So why isn't it a blockbuster drug for anti-aging today?
But let's face it, pharmaceutical companies are not in the business of leaving money on the table. If these peptides worked, like truly worked for fat loss, muscle building, anti-aging, the indications that people are buying them for, pharma would have chased those drug trials aggressively. The profit motive alone would have driven it. They didn't. They ran the numbers, they looked at the data, and they walked away. It doesn't mean that the drugs may not have some of the benefits, but if they saw in their early trial data that there was some problem with the drug, then they abandon it because the risk benefit isn't there.
And that's the market signal nobody wants to hear. These aren't compounds Big Pharma is hiding from you. These are compounds Big Pharma evaluated and actually abandoned, right? That doesn't make them useless. It means the evidence wasn't compelling enough for companies whose entire survival depends on finding drugs that work and finding drugs that they can sell and make money off of.
The online narrative is pharma can't patent them, so they're suppressing them. But many of these compounds actually have been patented. Companies just chose not to pursue any wider indications. Suppressed and abandoned for lack of evidence are very different stories.
And I think the crazy part I've got to throw in there, most people are ordering these peptides from the black market. And we know when you order medications or anything, knockoffs from the black market, you have no idea what you're getting. We would not order our produce from the black market and just be like, yep, like I'm going to put this in my body. But somehow people are ordering these needles and substances, injecting it into their body Like it could be cyanide, it could be arsenic. You have no clue. And that's a problem when all of this stuff shifts to the black market.
100%. So why don't we get into one of the big ones right now, and that is BPC 157. It's often combined with TB 500 called the Wolverine blend. And I think this is kind of where some of this gets troubling, right? So peptides are short chain amino acids. They basically are not as large as what we would consider like a full protein. They're smaller compounds, and yes, they are natural in the sense that they are derived from something that is actually naturally occurring. But be clear, these are all synthetic. These are all modified amino acid chains. They're not the exact thing that is circulating in our body. This is something that scientists have isolated and modified somehow and then made it available to us to use. So BPC 157 is derived from a protein in human gastric juice. The animal data on tissue healing and angiogenesis is genuinely intriguing. I won't pretend otherwise.
But let's talk about the human data. Tell people what the human data actually looks like.
Yeah, so there's been one registered phase 1 trial. It started in 2015 with 42 healthy volunteers. In 2016, the researchers canceled submission of the results. No explanation, no conclusions. The trial just vanished. Since then, there was one retrospective study of 12 patients with knee pain, no control group. And then there was a pilot study involving 2 healthy adults. 2. And FYI, like all of the papers that have been written about BPC all come from one researcher. By the way, it's the researcher who patented BPC from Croatia. And he's the one who started these trials and basically never reported any results.
No conflict of interest.
No conflict of interest whatsoever.
Yeah, let's just shoot up. Why not? Literally 2 people studied. That's the entire published human data set for a compound that millions of Americans are injecting weekly.
And unlike sermorelin or ipamorelin, BPC doesn't even have like an established mechanism of action. We at least know that sermorelin hits the growth hormone receptor hormone site, and we know ipamorelin mimics ghrelin. Real biology, even if the clinical case might be weak, with BPC 157, researchers have hypothesized some pathways, nitric oxide, angiogenesis, but there's literally no validated mechanism for this thing. Or how it supposedly might do what it's supposed to do.
And what do they claim that it does, BP157?
It started off as the healing peptide, like it heals tendons. But literally, there's if you go online, it can reverse Parkinson's disease. It can treat schizophrenia.
If you go online, if you go on Google or ChatGPT or this is not evidence-based.
I mean, there's no trials. So how do we even know?
Yeah.
It treats schizophrenia, cures ulcers, fixes dry eyes, fights cancer. When a compound is claimed to do everything, it should make you pretty suspicious that it probably does nothing in particular.
Now tell them about the patent.
Yeah. So, I mentioned this a few minutes ago. Virtually all the published research on BPC 157, literally over 150 papers, comes from one single research group at the University of Zagreb in Croatia, led by Professor Securic. Securic is named on the BPC 157 patent applications dating back to 1989. He's listed as the CEO of a company called Diogen, which is the company that owns the patent for a special stable version of BPC 157, currently on sale on their website. He also co-owns Pharmacotherapia, the company that sponsored the one human trial, the one conducted in Tijuana, whose results vanished.
You know what? If I wanted to go to the capital for research, I think the first place I think of is Tijuana, Mexico. Trusted, nothing shady. Like, that's where you're going to find me.
That's right.
Not Mayo Clinic.
So, virtually all the evidence for BPC 157 was generated by the person who holds the patent, owns the company selling it, and sponsored the trial that disappeared. And the compound that, thousands of Americans trust more than statins is basically fraud, in my opinion, until someone does some real research to prove otherwise.
Yeah, if Pfizer or Merck had this conflict of interest profile, self-funded studies, undisclosed financial interest, a vanished trial, right? A trial that just completely disappeared, no data. The same people promoting BPC 157 would be calling it corruption because it's sold as a natural peptide outside the pharmaceutical system. And that's a crazy part. When it's natural, it's not a pharmaceutical. They're not held to the same standard, right? So the scrutiny completely evaporates and these companies are allowed to claim whatever they want.
I mean, that brings us kind of to the last misconception, right? That peptides are safe because they're naturally occurring. Yes, BPC is derived from a gastric protein. People hear natural in their guard drops, but natural and safe are just not synonyms. Arsenic is natural, as I said. Rattlesnake venom is natural. Your stomach producing trace amounts of a parent protein during digestion is not the same thing as injecting a synthetic fragment under your skin 3 times a week. The dose, the route, the context, they all matter. And we have essentially no human data on any of that.
I think a good analogy, when our kids eat those fruit snacks and it says all natural fruit, it's as idiotic as someone actually thinking that that's fruit, right? Because it's all natural. No, but fruit snacks it's an ultra processed food. It's made in a plant. It's a chemical. So you cannot equate just because it says natural doesn't mean it's good for you.
90s marketing.
We fell for it.
Yeah. I think it's a little bit important for us to kind of get into why our brains get this backwards.
Yeah. So how did we get here? How did we arrive at a place where a drug studied in hundreds of thousands of humans is treated with more suspicion than a compound studied in 14 people?
Exactly. This is something I write about extensively in the book that I'm going to be publishing. And I think it's the most important concept for people to understand. Our brains are running really ancient software in a modern information environment. So the same cognitive tools that kept our ancestors alive on the savannah, pattern recognition, narrative thinking, the availability heuristic, are the same tools that make us wildly vulnerable to medical misinformation. We evolved in small groups of maybe, 50, 30 to 100, 150 people, where your cousin's experience with a poisonous berry was the best data you had going. There was no meta-analysis available on the savannah. There were no forest plots around the campfire. Our hardware was built for a world where individual stories were actual data.
Yeah. Walk people through the biases. We all have bias, but let's start with the basic one.
So availability heuristic. We judge the probability of events by how easily examples come to mind. Your neighbor's cousin who had muscle pain on a statin is vivid, it's emotional, and immediately available. 170,000 person meta-analysis is abstract, statistical, and basically invisible to us. The anecdote wins. It wins every time. And it doesn't matter how educated you are. This bias is not defeated by having a PhD. It's a feature of the architecture of our brain. It's not a bug you can think your way out of unless you have specific training on how to analyze statistics.
All right, let's move on to confirmation bias. Why don't you tell us what confirmation bias is?
So confirmation bias is, it's kind of a quiet one. Once you believe statins are harmful, you inhabit a completely different information universe. You notice every story about the side effect. You find communities that share your belief. You dismiss trial data as pharma funded. Your belief becomes unfalsifiable, which is a fancy way of saying nothing can ever really change your mind. And the social media algorithms are really happy to help with that, right? YouTube doesn't show you the boring meta-analysis. YouTube shows you the charismatic guy in a tank top who's going to explain what they don't want you to know.
And let's walk everyone through the seduction of certainty.
This one's honestly my favorite because our desire for certainty, it explains so much of the modern wellness culture. An honest physician who says statins reduce your risk by this much and carry these potential side effects, and the decision depends on your profile. That person sounds weak, right? They're hedging, they're uncertain. The influencer who says statins are poison, throw them away, here's what you need instead. That person sounds like a leader, and we are truly evolved to follow the confident leaders, not the hedging ones, because in the ancestral environment, confidence was a reasonable proxy for competence. The loudest, most certain voice in the tribe was usually the one who'd actually killed the mammoth. Today, the loudest, most certain voice is usually the one selling something, oftentimes a supplement or a peptide. But our hardware in our central nervous system, it just hasn't updated.
So we're all susceptible to that. Sometimes you get convinced because these people are convincing. They're so charismatic. They have their ring light, they're set up. And like you said, the algorithm of social media, I could just think about peptides and the next thing you know, I'm getting 10 different reels of peptides.
I mean, you don't have to go any further than looking at politics, right? Like, yeah. This is what America's political system is like also.
And on top of that, let's move on to risk. We're horrible. Humans are horrible at risk.
You hit the nail on the head. We are 100% horrible with risk. We truly overweigh rare dramatic events and underweigh the common slow ones. This is why people are terrified of sharks and indifferent to their blood pressure. The heart attack at 68 that's been building silently over 34 years, it doesn't feel real. It can't really compete with the vivid story of the guy who started a pill last month and got sore calves. The slow, invisible statistical benefit of a 25% risk reduction over decades is no match for an immediate, emotionally charged anecdote. Our brains treat might die in 20 years and will not die in 20 years as almost the same category. Both are basically like Tuesday.
And this is exactly what the peptide industry exploits.
Perfectly. The testimonial for the peptide industry is their entire marketing apparatus. The before and after photo, the guy on Instagram who says, I tore my rotator cuff and BPC healed it in 2 weeks. The story really activates every bias that we have. The availability bias, narrative, authority, confirmation, there's social proof, and all in just one single post. It feels like data, but it's not data. It's an anecdote from one person with no control group, no blinding, and every incentive to credit the injection rather than 6 other things that he might have been doing. Was he resting? Probably. Was he doing some physical therapy? Probably. Did he modify his training? Probably. Was his shoulder going to heal on its own the way most shoulder pain does? Probably. And our brains, which are magnificent at pattern recognition, really built for a world that no longer exists, they fall for this anecdotal evidence every single time.
Yeah, and pharmaceutical companies are held to a different standard. They cannot claim that a pharmaceutical drug does something unless it's been proven in trials. Whereas these supplements, peptides, anyone can say anything and there's no backlash. There's no consequence, right? So you can just say, this thing cured my cancer, and there's no fallout. And what happens? Patients suffer, they're misinformed, and they go down this rabbit hole instead of turning to real evidence.
Totally.
All right, let's move on to the next segment, why America is uniquely vulnerable. So let's zoom out, because I think there's something specific about American culture that makes us more susceptible to this than many other populations around the world.
I think this is important. It's a combination of at least 4 factors that converge in the US in a way that maybe they don't other places. First, it's our healthcare system. We are the only wealthy nation without universal healthcare. So millions of Americans have no real primary care relationship. Millions more have insurance that makes seeing a specialist prohibitively expensive. When you don't have a trusted physician who knows your history and can guide your decisions, you fill that void with whatever's available. And what's available is TikTok and Instagram and Joe Rogan and the guy at the gym. In countries with universal health care, UK, Canada, Scandinavia, Japan, people are more likely to have actual ongoing relationships with their doctors. They have someone to ask. The void is much smaller. In America, we've created a healthcare desert for tens of thousands, millions of people, and then we're surprised when they're irrigating with social media.
Yeah, and not to mention the millions of Americans like us that pay boatloads in monthly premiums to these health insurance companies and have $10,000 deductibles. So we're essentially paying for nothing because we're afraid to use it, and people end up canceling doctor's appointments, or there's wait lists. People can't get in to see their primary for 6 months, which is crazy. We are a first world country. This should not be happening. So let's move on to the second one. And this connects to what you wrote about in your article. It's the institutions that earned the mistrust. The opioid crisis, right, which killed over 500,000 Americans. This was not an accident. It was a product of deliberate pharmaceutical marketing. Americans watched that happen. They watched companies lie. They watched regulators fail to stop it. And they watched doctors become completely complicit in this whole opioid crisis. So that erosion of trust is not an irrational fear that Americans have. But the mistake is the leap of faith from pharmaceutical companies have sometimes lied to pharmaceutical science is completely a lie altogether. And that leap is more pronounced in America than almost anywhere else around the globe, because the opioid crisis was more devastating here than anywhere else.
Third, and I think this is also uniquely American, it's our relationship with capitalism and individual autonomy. I'm not against capitalism or individual autonomy, but we have a cultural DNA that says the free market sorts things out, that the individual should be able to make their own choices, that government regulation is inherently suspect. In most of Europe, if a compound hasn't been approved by a regulatory authority, the default assumption is it probably doesn't work or it isn't safe yet. In America, the default assumption is increasingly the government is keeping it from me because someone can't profit from it. That framing, regulation as suppression rather than protection, I think is distinctly American. And it's rocket fuel for the peptide market.
Yeah, for sure. And the fourth one is the natural is safe fallacy, which we covered. It's everywhere, but it is particular power here in America. Americans have a deep cultural association between natural being good. We spend more on supplements per capita than almost any other country on earth. The idea that a peptide is safe because it's derived from a naturally occurring compound, that it's somehow fundamentally different from a pharmaceutical because it comes from the body rather rather than a lab has enormous intuitive appeal. And the peptide industry absolutely knows this. That's why the marketing always emphasizes the natural origin. It's already in your body. It's completely natural. It's not a drug. It's a peptide. As if your body distinguishes between a synthetic 15 amino acid chain manufactured in a Chinese compounding plant, right? Versus what's actually created in your own body. So they are modified from what naturally occurs in the body, but like, make no mistake, these are lab made. And most of the time, these are coming from China.
And that final piece of the natural argument really needs to be dismantled. The claim that pharmaceutical companies don't want you taking peptides because they can't be patented. We just discussed, right, with BPC 157, literally it has a patent, right? Securic holds it, Diogen sells it. And for other peptides, sermorelin was patented and FDA approved. CJC 1295 was patented and ultimately was discarded because sermorelin and ipamorelin were better than CJC. These compounds went through the patent process. The companies evaluated the data for expanded indications and decided the evidence just really wasn't there. The big pharma is suppressing natural cures narrative is just wrong in this case. It's the opposite of what actually happened.
I think it's important to touch on the dangers of when things go underground. It's kind of like what you see in the emergency room when it comes to heroin overdoses, right? Most of the heroin now is laced with fentanyl or chemicals that are 10 times more potent than fentanyl. That's because heroin's illegal and it's underground. I think people should have the same skepticism with peptides because it's underground, because this is completely black market. You have no idea what's in it. Is it BP 157? Is it arsenic? Is it saline? Is it something else? We don't know. And it's almost impossible unless we start regulating it, which needs to happen for everyone's safety.
So I'd like to move on here and kind of talk about like what would the right way to talk about these compounds and how should we really evaluate these types of problems?
All right. So we've laid out the problem. Let's give our listeners something practical. What does good skepticism actually look like?
So, 5 questions. Apply them to every health claim, whether it comes from Pfizer or it comes from a guy with a ring light. 1, how many human beings has this actually been studied in? Not rats, not cell cultures, humans. And, obviously not 2 humans, thousands. Statins, for instance, hundreds of thousands, right? BPC, 14. 2, what is the absolute benefit? Not the relative benefit, not just a 25% reduction without knowing 25% of what. Demand absolute numbers. Anyone who only gives you relative numbers is either uninformed or trying to persuade you. 3, what are the actual harms? Documented in controlled trials, not anecdotes. The SAMSON trial showed 90% of statin side effects were nocebo effect. True pharmacologic muscle symptoms happen in 1% to 2%. That's a real number. 4, who is making the claim and what exactly is it that they're selling? Statin data comes from researchers funded by pharma, yes, but also from independent academic collaborations, Cochrane reviews, and government-funded meta-analyses. The BPC 157 data comes almost entirely from the person who holds the patent, when the strongest evidence for a compound is the research of the person most profiting from it. That should trigger the same skepticism you apply to the pharmaceutical ad. And 5, is the compound regulated? If not, why not? FDA approval is not a guarantee of safety, but the absence of FDA approval for a therapeutic compound in 2026 doesn't always mean the FDA is suppressing it. Sometimes it means nobody has done the work to prove it actually works. And sometimes, as in the case of BPC 157's case, the work was started and abandoned without any sort of explanation. that should concern you.
Yeah, I want to close with what I think is the uncomfortable part of all this.
The reason the peptide narrative is so seductive, and the reason millions of Americans would rather inject an unstudied compound than really take a well-studied pill, is not really about peptides or statins. It's about a healthcare system that has failed to earn trust, a medical profession that has failed to communicate honestly, and a population left to navigate an impossibly complex information environment with cognitive tools designed for a world that just doesn't exist anymore.
Yep. Like you said, we're running ancient pattern recognition software in a modern data saturated environment. We evolved to evaluate claims from people we knew personally in communities, like you said, of 50 people, 100 people, where reputation tracked reality. We did not evolve to evaluate compelling health claims from strangers on the internet, on TikTok, each backed by a sophisticated marketing and algorithm amplification with a like shot now, like click for my link in bio for my free just 20% off coupon.
And, that's not a reason to give up. It's a reason to just build better cognitive tools. We have to demand absolute numbers instead of relative ones. We have to ask the right questions. How many people has this been used in? Not like how many followers does this person have? Recognize that the most confident voice in the room is often the least trustworthy, and understand that genuine expertise almost always sounds like nuance.
Right? And we have to recognize the actual mismatch. You are not broken for finding this information difficult. You are mismatched. Your cognitive architecture was built for a different informational environment. And so recognizing that mismatch won't make you immune to manipulation on the internet, but it will give you friction. It will make you pause and give you a habit of asking, what would change my mind?
The statin on your nightstand, honestly, it's been studied in more human beings than most drugs in the history of medicine. The peptide in your fridge has been studied in fewer people than are sitting in your local coffee shop right now.
Yeah, sit with that information. It's crazy.
Then you should really decide who to trust and why.
Well, we hope you guys found this episode useful. I think the article, for those who enjoy those longer form pieces, Vikas wrote a full article in Stat and Substack about this topic. And if you guys have any other questions and things that you want us to cover, but we're in the business of playing the long game. And I think it's going to be interesting to see in 5, 10, 15, 20 years what happens when an entire generation of people in their 40s have been taking these unstudied peptides and what comes from it. We're not saying peptides are bad. We're just saying it is too soon to tell, and it's black market right now. And you should be skeptical of anything you're putting in your body that you're ordering off the internet.
And, the flip side of that, statins aren't for everyone, and we make no money by promoting statins or anything either. So the nuance here is just, we got to be able to look at the data for what it is and recognize that we have these biases and we're very suspicious of lots of stuff. Unfortunately, it plays into the way that we have evolved. And there's a lot of people in the public space that know how to manipulate the way that we think based off of these biases that we all have. And we should really be suspicious of that more than anything.
For sure.
All right, guys, thank you so much for joining us today. Please send us messages if you have questions. Please leave us reviews, and please follow us on our Instagram, Substack, Spotify, Apple Podcasts,
YouTube, TikTok.
We love TikTok.
I hate TikTok.
All right, thanks for playing the long game. Thank you for playing the long game with MD Longevity Lab. You can visit us at www.mdlongevitylab.com to learn more about how we can support you on your journey. Stay connected with us on social media at MD Longevity Lab for tips, updates, and behind-the-scenes insights. If you enjoyed today's episode, we'd love it if you subscribed, left us a rating, or shared it with someone you know who's also playing the long game. Thanks for listening. We'll see you next time.